What if the crown's real heirloom wasn't duty, but desire? Behind palace walls and centuries of pomp, the British royal family has hidden a truth far less polished. Some of its most famous members were ruled not by tradition, but by obsession. Affairs, whispers, scandals buried in velvet. This isn't the history they teach at school. This is the one they try to forget. 20 royals. One common addiction. And a monarchy desperately trying to keep the curtains drawn. Welcome to 20 British royals who were sex addicts. Just don't expect loyalty to mean the same thing behind closed doors. Before we dive in, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss the royal secrets they don't put on the family crest. And while you're here, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from and what time is it right now? Are you up late spiraling into scandal or starting your day with a bit of monarchy-induced mayhem? Either way, you're in the right place. Let's begin. 1. Henry VIII. History remembers Henry VIII as the king with 6 wives. That's not quite accurate. History has 6 names. Henry had needs. Long before he split the Church of England in two like a rotten pomegranate, Henry was already letting other things split first. His pants, for instance, due to his famously expanding waistline, and more metaphorically, the boundaries between monarchy and indulgence. To call him a sex addict is a simplification. Henry was something far worse, a man who mistook his appetite for divine right. He was not the first English monarch to enjoy the company of women, but he might have been the first to turn courtship into a blood sport. The stories we know, the wives, the executions, the annulments, they're just the main cast. Behind them stands an entire army of forgotten names. Mistresses who were silenced, shuffled, or strategically married off. Servants whose flirtations were criminalized. Women who were adored until they were inconvenient. Henry wasn't just horny, he was spiritually entitled to possession. His libido wasn't scandalous because it was large. It was scandalous because it had its own royal seal. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, was his brother's widow. A theological gray area he pretended not to notice until she couldn't give him a son. Enter Anne Boleyn, the clever, magnetic courtier who played hard to get because she knew being got was dangerous. Henry fell for her, or rather, for the idea that she might finally validate his obsession with legacy. The sexual tension was so thick it changed the religious structure of an entire continent. For 7 years he waited for Anne. That's the thing about Henry. His desire was most intense in denial. Once he had her, it faded, like everything else that bored him after the chase. He moved on, as monarchs do. Jane Seymour, the quiet one. Anne of Cleves, the one he didn't like the look of. Catherine Howard, the teenage one. Catherine Parr, the nurse. The conveyor belt of queens kept spinning, and with each marriage came whispers of the mistresses waiting in the wings. Margaret Shelton, Elizabeth Blount, Mary Boleyn, Anne's sister naturally. It didn't matter how many names were lost to time. Henry had institutionalized desire. It had a crown, a court, and a death toll. This wasn't just royal misbehavior. It was something colder. Henry's sexuality wasn't impulsive, it was weaponized. He used affection like a guillotine and lust like a ledger. If you pleased him, you were rewarded. If you disappointed him, you were rebranded as immoral. Anne Boleyn was called a seductress and a witch after years of his infatuation. Catherine Howard was executed at 19, not for being disloyal, but for having been too alive before she met him. The courtiers learned quickly. Flirtation was a currency, and fear was its inflation. The court became a theater of smiling faces and hidden alliances. Every laugh at the king's joke was a gamble. Every dance at a feast could lead to elevation or exile. Love was replaced by strategy. And in the middle of it all was Henry, bloated, paranoid, and still convinced that his lust was sacred. Historians have debated whether Henry was a narcissist, a religious zealot, or just a lonely man in an echo chamber of his own making. Maybe all three. But what's clear is this: Sex was never just sex to Henry. It was a form of legacy. It was a way to bend the rules of God and man. His bedchamber was a political crucible. His queens were pawns, queens, then martyrs. Even in his later years, ravaged by gout, ulcers, and the slow decay of unchecked power, Henry remained obsessed with his image as a virile king. He wore armor he could barely move in. He summoned wives like couriers. He took pleasure in appearances long after the reality was gone. The desire had outlived the body. That might be the most dangerous kind of addiction, the kind that survives even after it can no longer be satisfied. And maybe that's the true horror of Henry VIII. Not the beheadings or the betrayals or the desperate search for a male heir, but the way he turned love into law and lust into divine right. He rewrote morality to suit his appetite and punished anyone who reminded him that even kings have limits. You'd think England might have learned something from him. But then along came a monarch who skipped the beheadings and kept the beds full. A man who laughed at the idea of restraint, who wore his appetites like a velvet robe and made pleasure his brand. They called him the Merry Monarch. They should have called him the original party king. 2. Charles II. If Henry VIII turned lust into law, Charles II turned it into a lifestyle brand. He didn't rule by divine right so much as he entertained by it. When the English monarchy was restored in 1660, after years of Puritan rule under Cromwell, Charles stepped onto the throne with one clear mission: to make England fun again. His enemies called him immoral. His friends called him charming. History calls him the Merry Monarch. And that title, while affectionate, hides the quiet pathology of a man who never stopped trying to fill an empty space with laughter, luxury, and flesh. Charles II was a walking contradiction, a king raised in exile, a child of chaos, and a ruler who inherited a traumatized nation. England had beheaded one monarch, outlawed pleasure, banned theaters, and declared even Christmas illegal. Then suddenly, curtains open, Charles returned from France with long curls, a continental accent, and an entourage of poets, dancers, and courtesans. He didn't bring reform, he brought relief, and his court became the country's collective exhale after years of tight moral corsets. He loved wit, he loved theater, he loved the company of women, and not as accessories but as personalities. His mistresses weren't nameless figures behind tapestries, they were celebrities. Nell Gwynn, the orange seller turned actress, was as famous as any royal. Barbara Villiers, tempestuous and politically dangerous, dominated his early reign. Louise de Querouaille, a French import, was soft-spoken but calculating. Moll Davis, another actress, once received a house and pension for a single night's company. The palace was a carousel of charisma. But this wasn't hedonism for its own sake. There was method in the merriment. Charles II's charm was political armor. By surrounding himself with laughter and love affairs, he disarmed his critics. Every scandal distracted from deeper tensions: parliament, war debts, religious conflict. A lascivious monarch was easier to mock than to fear. Charles knew that a king who laughed at himself couldn't easily be accused of tyranny. Yet behind the feasts and flirtations lay a familiar melancholy. Those close to him noted that his eyes, though quick to smile, often looked distant. He had seen exile, assassination plots, and betrayal. Pleasure wasn't just an indulgence. It was a shield against emptiness. He didn't trust anyone who didn't make him laugh, perhaps because laughter was the only thing that didn't demand loyalty. His bedchamber was an extension of diplomacy. Lovers were chosen not only for beauty, but for political convenience. The king's mistresses held influence. They secured pensions, titles, and ambassadorial favors. The line between pillow talk and policy was perilously thin. There were nights when the future of England was decided between whispered words on silk sheets. Not that the minutes were ever recorded. Still, There was an odd kind of equality in his court, for all. 4. Its decadence, Charles's reign gave women a visibility unseen in Tudor or Stuart politics. The mistresses weren't hidden. They were public figures, painted by court artists, immortalized by gossip, caricatured by pamphleteers. They wielded soft power through beauty and access, and Charles didn't hide them because he didn't see desire as a sin. To him, repression was the greater vice. The irony, of course, is that his reign, defined by pleasure, was also haunted by plague, fire, and paranoia. The Great Plague of 1665 emptied London. The Great Fire of 1666 burned it down. The king fled the city but returned to personally oversee relief efforts. The same man who lounged with actresses by night commanded bucket brigades by day. It's hard not to see him as a study in contrasts, libertine and leader, cynic and caretaker, and maybe that's what made him so magnetic. Charles didn't pretend to be pure. He didn't hide his appetites behind sanctimony. He turned transparency into a virtue. When Parliament questioned his morals, he replied, "I am a great sinner, but I have been forgiven." It wasn't repentance, it was confession as performance art. His humor made hypocrisy unnecessary. But pleasure, even royal pleasure, has a cost. By the end of his reign, Charles was surrounded by debts, illegitimate children, and shifting alliances. He had no legitimate heir, only a long list of charming bastards, many of whom would go on to shape European politics. The name Fitzroy, meaning son of the king, multiplied like a genetic watermark. He had created a dynasty of desire. On his deathbed, Charles reportedly told his brother, "Let not poor Nellie starve," referring to his beloved mistress Nell Gwyn. It was his last joke and his last kindness. He died as he lived, aware of his flaws, fond of the women who made his world bearable, and unconvinced that abstinence ever saved anyone. The court mourned him, but England moved on, just as it always does. His illegitimate children married into noble families. His wit lived on in satire. His reputation softened into nostalgia. The merry monarch became a symbol of freedom and forgiveness, even though his reign was anything but free from consequences. Perhaps Charles II's true addiction wasn't to sex at all, but to distraction. To the fleeting comfort of pleasure in a country that had forgotten how to laugh. His bed may have been crowded, but his heart was oddly solitary. A stage forever in search of an audience. And when the curtain finally fell, England discovered that even the most charming hedonist can't escape the gravity of his own indulgence. Because waiting in the wings was another royal, one who had the same hunger but none of the humor. A prince so devoted to pleasure that it stopped being performance and became pathology. He didn't hide in wit or disguise his vices as diplomacy. He was excess in human form. They called him the Prince of Pleasure. History would remember him as George IV. If you're still with us after Charles II turned the royal court into a full-time after-party, you're exactly our kind of viewer. Go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment below. Where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are right now? Midnight gossip session? Lunchtime scandal snack? We want to know. Now, ready for a prince who made indulgence into pathology? Let's talk about George IV. 3. George IV. By the time George IV finally became king, England already knew too much. They'd seen the portraits, heard the rumors, read the pamphlets. They knew about the secret wife, the debts, the mistresses, the dinners, the diamonds, the tailor's bills longer than most chapters of the Bible. George wasn't a mystery. He was an open scandal with a crown waiting at the end. Before he wore it, he wore everything else: velvet, lace, rouge, and regret. As Prince of Wales, he was less a monarch in waiting and more a walking operetta of appetite. His obsession with pleasure didn't express itself in the gleeful charm of Charles II or the dynastic desperation of Henry VIII. No, George was different. George was committed to self-indulgence as a form of protest, as if excess itself could somehow fix the chronic disappointment of being a future king with no real power. He wasn't born for restraint. He was born in 1762, into a world cracking at its colonial seams. His father, George III, suffered periodic mental collapses. His country was reeling from the loss of the American colonies. The monarchy was wobbling, and the heir was decorating his rooms with satin and commissioning erotic miniatures for private viewings. At 21, George fell in love with a Catholic widow, Maria Fitzherbert, and secretly married her. It was illegal under the Royal Marriages Act and invalid under English law, but spiritually, emotionally, and dramatically, it was as real as anything he ever did. It was also ruinous. The marriage enraged Parliament, alienated his father, and was swiftly buried beneath a mountain of polite denials. But it never quite went away. The Fitzherbert affair haunted him like a moral footnote he couldn't edit out. In public, George was a connoisseur of the theatrical. He transformed the Brighton seaside into his own pleasure dome, the Royal Pavilion, an architectural fever dream of domes, minarets, and chinoiserie, built less like a royal residence and more like a mirage made of opium and debt. It was an escape, not just from politics, but from the tedious limitations of Englishness itself. George hated the dull, gray Protestant morality he was supposed to represent. So he built a palace that looked like a joke the British Empire wasn't in on. He gambled. He ate like there was a famine on the horizon. He drank with a zeal that suggested personal vengeance against sobriety. He surrounded himself with artists, dandies, and courtesans. But he wasn't just collecting company. He was curating a world where consequences didn't exist. Or at least, not for him. His debts, however, did. By 1795, he was forced into a public marriage with his cousin, Caroline of Brunswick, to qualify for more funding from Parliament. The wedding was a disaster. He was reportedly drunk. She found him repulsive. He found her vulgar. They had one child, Charlotte, and then avoided each other like history books avoid nuance. The marriage produced scandal after scandal, culminating in a failed attempt by George to divorce Caroline when he became king. Parliament turned it into a grotesque public trial. The people sided with Caroline. George, crowned but unloved, was left red-faced beneath his absurd pile of coronation jewels. Still, he kept going. He threw lavish banquets with silver cutlery engraved with his own face. He wore corsets to contain a stomach that grew steadily under layers of rich food and richer denial. He appeared in public swaddled in silks and indignation. He was a king so deeply devoted to presentation that the substance of monarchy seemed almost an afterthought. And through it all, always, there were the women. Mistresses known and unknown, relationships transactional and obsessive. Lady Hertford, Lady Conyngham, the actresses, the dancers. Some adored him, some tolerated him. Some left quickly, others stayed for the pension. But despite the endless parade of pleasure, George remained curiously unsatisfied. He pursued beauty with desperation, but when he caught it, it bored him. His relationships were filled with conflict, control, and escape. Like Henry VIII, he wanted devotion. Like Charles II, he wanted charm. But unlike either, he wanted pity. He saw himself as misunderstood, a romantic trapped in a bureaucrat's world, forced to rule a nation that didn't appreciate his tastes. And in that self-pity, he became grotesque. By the end of his life, George IV was bloated, blind in one eye, and barely able to walk. He spent days alone in Windsor Castle, surrounded by portraits of women he once loved, or claimed to. The man who once staged pleasure-like theater now lived in the gloom of drawn curtains. He refused visitors. He spoke often of death. And he left behind a legacy not of greatness, but of grandeur. His reign is remembered more for architecture and upholstery than for governance. He did not change England, but he did change how royalty looked and how far it could fall into itself before the public lost patience. His only legitimate daughter, Charlotte, died before him. There would be no romantic continuation, no fairy tale ending, just a king buried beneath debts, portraits, and sighs. And yet, for all his faults, George had one quality that made him unforgettable. He was honest about his vanity. He never pretended to be virtuous. He simply asked to be loved despite himself. It's hard to imagine England forgiving him today. But at least he didn't design custom furniture for his liaisons. That particular innovation belonged to someone else, a future king whose appetite was matched only by his engineering skills. A man so committed to pleasure, he had it upholstered. 4. Edward VII. Before he was Edward VII, he was Albert Edward, Bertie to his family, Dirty Bertie to the tabloids, and eventually just the kind of man who would monogram his bath towels but forget to write back to Parliament. While his mother, Queen Victoria, mourned her dead husband with a century's worth of black lace, Bertie mourned his own relevance, at brothels, dinner parties, racetracks, and in bedrooms that weren't his. He spent nearly 60 years as heir to the throne. That's a long time to wait. Most men, given that much idle time and that much access, would take up gardening or stamp collecting. Bertie took up pleasure, all of it, repeatedly, and in every conceivable form, as long as it involved good food, better cigars, and someone else's wife. He was the first modern celebrity royal. His scandals sold papers. His silhouette became a brand. The country whispered about his conquests with something between envy and exhaustion. His legendary appetite, social, sexual, sartorial, wasn't a secret. It was the story. By the time he became king in 1901, he had long since become a kind of aristocratic open secret. Everybody knew what he was, but no one dared to say it directly. His very existence was a carefully managed contradiction. Outwardly jovial and diplomatic, privately indulgent and obsessive. He played the affable uncle at official functions, then slipped away to the Parisian demi-monde, where the velvet was thicker, the champagne colder, and the company far more interesting. The tales of his extramarital adventures often read like satire. There was Lily Langtry, the Jersey Lily, an actress so luminous she seemed carved from scandal. There was Daisy Greville, Countess of Warwick, whose political radicalism was only slightly less famous than her bedroom diplomacy. And there was Alice Keppel, perhaps his most enduring mistress, a woman so skilled in managing the royal ego that she became, unofficially, the First Lady of Edwardian England. She would later become the great-grandmother of Camilla Parker Bowles, because history, like taste, is cyclical. But Bertie's pursuits weren't purely romantic. They were tactical. His liaisons often aligned with social alliances. A mistress was never just a mistress. She was a conversation partner, a rumor control mechanism, a subtle ambassador. If Charles II used mistresses as shields, Edward VII used them as mirrors, each one reflecting back a version of himself he wished to believe. Irresistible, wise, adored. His affections weren't restricted to individuals. They extended to the trappings of indulgence. He was a connoisseur of fine dining, a pioneer of what would become haute cuisine in Britain. Meals weren't meals. They were multi-hour rituals. He once dined with 12 courses, each paired with its own wine, and followed it with cigars so large they might qualify as infrastructure. He introduced the tuxedo to America. He made being overweight fashionable. He carried himself with the self-satisfaction of a man who believed appetites were virtues. And in his world, they were. But there was a strange kind of self-awareness in Bertie. Unlike George IV, who wallowed in self-pity, or Henry VIII, who demanded worship, Edward VII understood that he was a symbol. He just didn't particularly mind if that symbol was a little rumpled. In public, he was diplomatic, politically astute, and surprisingly effective. In private, he was a creature of habit, reliable in his unpredictability, consistent in his inconsistency. He balanced his hedonism with a kind of performative discipline, punctual, charming, and rarely cruel. He even engineered pleasure, There are persistent rumors of a specially designed love chair at a Parisian brothel, allegedly built to accommodate his increasing size and increasingly creative romantic pursuits. Whether it existed or not is almost irrelevant. The fact that people believed it did says everything about how Bertie was perceived. Less a man, more a legend upholstered in excess. Victoria, of course, disapproved of everything. She saw his lifestyle as a national embarrassment, a moral decline with a cigar in one hand and a showgirl in the other. She blamed him for his father's death, his brother's decline, and the general erosion of English dignity. When she finally died, Bertie reportedly wept, not out of grief, but from sheer relief. He was 59, a man who had waited a lifetime to rule, and when he finally ascended the throne, it was like watching a retired actor stumble back into the spotlight, confused that the script had changed. To his credit, Edward VII was a far better king than anyone expected. He stabilized foreign relations, especially with France. He charmed diplomats. He revitalized the monarchy's image, even as his waistline continued to expand. His public image softened. His private indulgences were brushed aside. He had, against all odds, matured. Slightly. And yet, for all the kingly gravitas he tried to project, his legacy remains tangled in silk sheets and cigar smoke. He lived in a world where pleasure was both political and personal, where being seen with the right woman was as important as saying the right thing, where monarchy wasn't about divine right, it was about maintaining the illusion of effortless charm, no matter the cost. Edward VII died in 1910, leaving behind a thoroughly modern mess. A son, George V, who saw pleasure as a threat, a court that had to relearn restraint, and a monarchy that would spend the next century pretending none of this ever happened. But if Edward VII was the end of an era, he wasn't the only royal to live scandalously in silk. Before him, centuries earlier, a queen burned through 3 husbands and left Europe whispering her name in both reverence and suspicion. Her name was Mary, and she ruled with a crown in one hand and chaos in the other. 5. Mary, Queen of Scots. In the long and blood-smeared tapestry of British royalty, Mary, Queen of Scots is the figure embroidered in passion and shadow. Born in 1542 and crowned just days later, she was a queen by birth and a scandal by design. Mary didn't just inspire obsession, she radiated it. Men followed her into war, into exile, into ruin. She left a trail of poetry, plots, and corpses, and yet even centuries later, historians are still trying to decide whether she was a reckless romantic or a woman undone by the fantasies of others. Maybe both. That's the trouble with Mary. She was always 2 things at once. To begin with, Mary was a threat, not because of her armies, though she had those too, but because of her bloodline. She was a Catholic in a rising Protestant world. She had a legitimate claim to the English throne, which made her dangerous to Elizabeth I and fascinating to anyone else with a taste for treason. But beyond the politics was the persona. Tall, graceful, fluent in several languages, trained in courtly arts, and raised in France among poets and princes. She was practically engineered to cause distraction, and she did, constantly. Her first marriage was to Francis II of France. He was 15, sickly, and died a year later. Mary returned to Scotland a teenage widow, still regal, still captivating, but suddenly alone. And then came Darnley. Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, her cousin, handsome, tall, and catastrophically useless. On paper he made sense, uniting 2 claims to the English throne. In person he made very little sense at all. Vain, spoiled, and deeply insecure, Darnley oscillated between jealousy and self-destruction with the grace of a dropped chandelier. Mary married him anyway. Love? Political strategy? Some say both. Others say neither. Regardless, the marriage collapsed faster than most of Darnley's decisions. Things took a darker turn with the murder of David Rizzio, Mary's secretary and close confidant. One night in 1566, Darnley and a group of nobles stormed into Mary's chambers while she was dining, heavily pregnant, and stabbed Rizzio over 50 times in front of her. The motive? Rumors of an affair. The reality? Likely none. But with Mary, rumors often passed for truth. The court didn't need evidence. It needed drama. Darnley, perhaps realizing that orchestrating a murder in front of your royal wife isn't exactly endearing, tried to win her back. She forgave him. Publicly. Privately, she drifted. Enter James Hepburn, 4th Earl of Bothwell. Rough, battle-hardened, and charismatic in the way dangerous men often are. Whether Mary loved him or merely saw him as a necessary weapon in a collapsing kingdom is unclear. What is clear is that Darnley was found dead not long after, strangled in a garden following an explosion that conveniently failed to kill him. Bothwell was implicated but acquitted, possibly because the trial was a formality. Days later, he allegedly kidnapped Mary, possibly with her consent, and married her. Either way, the optics were catastrophic. The nobles revolted. Mary was imprisoned. Bothwell fled and died raving in a Danish prison. And once again, Mary's life became a subject of voyeuristic fascination. Had she orchestrated Darnley's death? Had she been manipulated? Seduced? Was she a femme fatale or a political casualty? England didn't know. Scotland didn't care. And Elizabeth I, watching from across the border, saw a rival ripe for containment. Mary fled to England seeking protection. Elizabeth gave her a cell. For the next 19 years, Mary lived in a royal limbo, part prisoner, part threat, part tabloid headline in a ruffled collar. Her sexuality, once used to charm and consolidate, became weaponized against her. Every man she'd ever looked at was cast as a co-conspirator. Her romantic past became her political future. She was no longer a queen. She was an idea. Dangerous, unruly, romantic, and expendable. Eventually, Elizabeth signed her death warrant. Officially, it was for treason. Unofficially, it was for being the wrong kind of queen, one who felt too much, loved too often, and reminded the English court that passion could still be fatal. Mary was beheaded in 1587. It didn't go cleanly. Nothing about her life ever did. But her legacy persisted, partly because of her tragedy, but mostly because she was the rare royal who seemed to live fully, messily, and unapologetically. Her affairs, whether real or fabricated, became fables. Her letters, whether authentic or forged, read like sonnets dipped in venom. Her allure survived because it refused to be moralized. She wasn't good. She wasn't evil. She was simply alive in a time when women in power were expected to be statues. And for the men around her, that was unbearable. Mary, Queen of Scots, wasn't a sex addict in the way modern headlines would frame it. She was a woman who loved too intensely, trusted too quickly, and ruled in a world that punished desire when it came dressed in a gown and a crown. But if her passion destroyed her, it also immortalized her. And she would not be the last queen to fall for the wrong man in the wrong bed at the wrong time. Because decades later, another royal woman would dance her way into the court of Henry VIII, armed with charm, ambition, and eyes sharp enough to make a king unravel. Her name was Catherine Howard. 6. Catherine Howard. Catherine Howard was never supposed to be queen. She was barely supposed to be noticed. The fifth wife of Henry VIII came into history like a gust of warm, perfumed air through a dungeon window, light, flirtatious, full of promise, and ultimately doomed. Her story isn't just a cautionary tale. It's an indictment of power, lust, and the dangerous illusion that youth equals control. Born around 1523, Catherine entered the royal narrative not as a princess, but as an orphan. Her father, a minor noble with a long title and very little money, sent her off to be raised in the household of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. This was less a nursery and more a finishing school of organized chaos. The Duchess's home was filled with noble girls of varying supervision, chaperoned in name only. It was a place where flirtation flourished, secrets gathered like dust in tapestries, and young women learned that beauty was currency. And there were always buyers. Catherine learned quickly. She knew how to catch an eye, how to hold a gaze just long enough, and how to navigate a world that only rewarded the visible. She had admirers early on, music tutors, courtiers in training, and whether she understood the implications or not, she was already being shaped into someone else's fantasy. By the time she arrived at court in 1539, she wasn't yet 17. She joined the household of Anne of Cleves, Henry's fourth wife, a German princess whose political usefulness vastly outshone her personal compatibility with the king. Henry found Anne dull, and then he noticed Catherine, younger, softer, livelier. Anne was diplomatic linen. Catherine was silk with a laugh. Within months, Anne was out, and Catherine was in. She married Henry in July 1540. He was nearly 50. She was likely no older than 17. The age difference was not just numerical, it was cosmic. Henry was a king wounded by time, obese, paranoid, with a festering leg ulcer and an increasingly brittle ego. Catherine was fresh, flirtatious, and unburdened by the past. Or so he thought. To Henry, Catherine was more than a wife. She was restoration. She reminded him of the youth he had lost, the virility he pretended to maintain, and the power he imagined still came effortlessly. He called her his rose without a thorn, which is a charming sentiment unless you've read literally any history. But Catherine's world didn't shrink when she became queen. It just got more complicated. She was surrounded by men who remembered her as the girl from the Dowager Duchess's house. Francis Derham, a former admirer, re-entered her orbit. So did Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber, young, handsome, and dangerously close to the queen. Whether she resumed relationships with them out of affection, habit, or desperation is unclear. What is clear is that she was under constant observation, and the Tudor court loved nothing more than watching a beautiful woman fail. Rumors began to spread, quietly, then loudly. A letter discovered, a chambermaid questioned, and suddenly the entire royal court became a theater of whispers. Henry, upon hearing the allegations, didn't rage. He crumbled. His vision of Catherine, pure, youthful, redemptive, shattered like a mirror too proud to reflect honestly. Catherine was arrested. She was never granted a trial. Just interrogations, confessions, and silence. Those who had once flattered her now fled. Francis Derham and Thomas Culpeper were executed. She was stripped of her title, her dignity, and her place in the world she had only just entered. On February 13, 1542, Catherine was taken to the Tower Green and beheaded. The legend says she practiced laying her head on the block the night before, asking for it to be done quickly. History doesn't confirm this, but it doesn't have to. The image persists because it feels true. Because Catherine's greatest crime wasn't betrayal. It was being too young, too visible, and too unaware of how little protection beauty actually provides. Some historians argue that she was reckless. Others say she was a victim of exploitation. Both are likely correct. She was a girl raised in a system that taught her she was only worth as much as she could attract. A court that taught men to chase and women to charm. A monarchy that demanded perfection and then punished it for being false. Henry VIII mourned her in his way, quietly, bitterly. Perhaps he saw in her downfall the same decay that had taken root in his own reign. Catherine Howard didn't ruin him, but she reminded him that youth, once desired, becomes dangerous when it learns to act on its own. Her short, tragic story echoed through the corridors of English history, not as a lesson in morality, but as a quiet, devastating question. What happens to a girl when her desirability becomes her death sentence? And Catherine was not the only Boleyn-adjacent figure to meet such a fate. Because before her came the woman who rewrote the rules of seduction and power in Tudor England. A woman whose rise and fall were not just scandalous, they were seismic. Anne Boleyn was no rose without a thorn. She was the thorn. 7. Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn did not enter history quietly. She entered like a question mark wrapped in velvet, hard to read, impossible to ignore. To some, she was the mother of the English Reformation. To others, a sorceress who enchanted a king and cursed a nation. What she was, undeniably, was one of the most enigmatic and seductive figures ever to wear a crown that later cost her her head. Long before she became queen, Anne understood the power of presence. She wasn't the most traditionally beautiful woman at court, not by the standards of the 16th century. Her skin was darker than fashionable, her features sharp, her figure slight. But her mind was precise, her eyes magnetic, and her voice, laced with wit and confidence, was unlike anything the English court had heard before. She didn't flirt so much as engage. She didn't plead. She parried. Born into the ambitious Boleyn family around 1501, Anne was raised across European courts, the Netherlands, then France, absorbing the sophistication, religious reform, and courtly intrigue that would shape her into something far more dangerous than a beauty, an idea. She returned to England in the early 1520s and almost immediately disrupted everything. She first caught the attention of Henry Percy, heir to the Earl of Northumberland, but that engagement was shut down by Cardinal Wolsey, likely under pressure from King Henry VIII himself. That's because Henry had already noticed her. His first interactions with Anne were probably driven by the usual royal appetites. She was clever, elusive, and crucially, refused to become just another mistress. He was already entangled with her sister, Mary Boleyn, who may have borne him children. But Anne would not play second-hand royalty. She wasn't going to be a footnote. If she was going to be in Henry's life, she would be in his history. And Henry chased her. For nearly 7 years. This was no casual infatuation. His letters to her survive. Desperate, clumsy, tender, obsessive. He offered her titles, jewelry, promises of future coronations. Anne responded with cool affection, measured words, and a growing understanding that this was not just about desire. It was about leverage. If she held out, she could become not just queen, but catalyst. And that's exactly what happened. What followed is one of the greatest political and religious shifts in European history. Henry, in pursuit of Anne, defied the Pope, severed England from the Catholic Church, declared himself head of the Church of England, and invalidated his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. All to marry Anne Boleyn, in secret, in haste, in triumph. She was crowned in 1533 in a lavish ceremony meant to signify not just legitimacy, but destiny. She was the queen, the woman for whom a king had upended Christendom. For a moment she had everything: a husband in love, a crown on her head, and a nation watching. But Anne's power was never comfortable. She had enemies everywhere: staunch Catholics, noble families loyal to Catherine, and even those within the court who simply didn't like a woman who refused to smile politely and stay quiet. Her personality was described as sharp, arrogant, and politically ruthless. But those traits were necessary. She was playing a game where most women didn't survive, let alone win. She was expected to deliver a son. She gave birth instead to a daughter, Elizabeth, who would later become one of the most iconic monarchs in history, but at the time was seen as a bitter disappointment. A miscarriage followed, then another. The king's affection began to cool, and with it, Anne's position. Henry had moved on before the paperwork was even dry. He had noticed Jane Seymour, quiet and compliant. Everything Anne wasn't. But to get rid of a queen was not a simple matter. Divorce would have been politically messy. So the court began to build a case. In 1536, Anne was arrested and accused of adultery, not with one man but with 5, including her own brother, George Boleyn. The charges were preposterous. The evidence was laughably thin. But Anne was no longer just a wife, she was a liability. And liabilities are dangerous when they're articulate. Her trial was more performance than justice. She defended herself brilliantly, but it didn't matter. She had become too powerful to be ignored and too inconvenient to be kept alive. She was convicted and sentenced to death. On May 19, 1536, Anne was executed at the Tower of London. She wore a gray damask gown and met her death with composure. Her final words were elegant, almost poetic, praising the king who had ordered her death, likely to spare her daughter. The executioner used a sword instead of an axe, imported from France at Anne's request. Even in death, she preferred precision over spectacle. Anne Boleyn didn't die because she failed to please the king. She died because she succeeded too well. At captivating him, at influencing policy, at becoming more than he ever intended her to be. Her sexuality wasn't reckless. It was calibrated. Her flirtations weren't foolish. They were political tools in a world that offered women few weapons. And yet, for all her calculations, Anne was still mortal, still vulnerable, still trapped in a system that turned women into trophies and then shattered them when they no longer gleamed. Anne's legacy didn't end with her death. It echoed through the life of her daughter, Elizabeth I, who would rule alone, marry no one, and make sure no man would ever decide her fate. But in Anne's time, power came at a fatal cost. And yet, centuries later, another royal would walk a similarly dangerous line. A man born into privilege but drawn to secrecy. A prince whose own appetites defied the expectations of masculinity, decorum, and royal image. He didn't write letters, he hid them. He didn't chase glory, he chased escape. His name was Prince George, Duke of Kent. 8. Prince George, Duke of Kent. If British royalty has a family vault of secrets, Prince George, Duke of Kent, might be the velvet-draped keyhole. Born in 1902, the 4th son of King George V and Queen Mary, he should have been a footnote. Too far down the line of succession to matter politically, too close to the center of power to misbehave openly. But instead of fading into ceremonial obscurity, George lived as if scandal were oxygen, and discretion, an accessory he could put on or take off, depending on the outfit. He was glamorous. That's not a word often used for Windsor men who tend to oscillate between stern and starch stiff. But George was different, with slicked back hair, movie star cheekbones, and a wardrobe that whispered continental temptation. He cut a figure more suited to Hollywood than Buckingham. He spoke French like a diplomat, played the piano like a lounge act, and cultivated a taste for people who didn't show up on official guest lists. He was fluent in charm and allergic to boredom. Officially, he served in the Royal Navy and later the Royal Air Force. Unofficially, he was the prince who treated uniformed service like an intermission between acts in a cabaret of carefully managed chaos. He had the resume of a dutiful royal, overseas tours, medals, briefcases, and the habits of a man trying to outrun the dull weight of royal life with high society's most dangerous distractions. There are whispers, too many to ignore and too consistent to dismiss, that Prince George's life was not just scandalous, but spectacularly layered. He was rumored to have had relationships with both men and women. Not whispered flirtations or accidental touches at candlelit dinners, but full-blown affairs with diplomats, actors, artists, and occasionally people who had dossiers filed on them by multiple governments. Some names, like Noel Coward and Jorge Ferrara, swirl through the biographies like ghosts that refuse to be pinned down. His sexuality remains a blurred line, mostly because the palace had a habit of erasing what it couldn't explain. And Prince George didn't help. He moved through London society like a man immune to consequences, equally comfortable in the drawing rooms of dukes and the dressing rooms of actors. It wasn't so much rebellion as it was refined refusal. A refusal to play the part of the royal automaton. And then there were the drugs. Again, rumors, but persistent ones. Morphine, barbiturates, cocaine, none confirmed beyond the speculative, but all orbiting his name like satellites. The pattern is familiar. A royal caught between duty and desire, numbing the contradiction with whatever was available. For George, it seems the line between pleasure and coping mechanism was so thin it may never have existed. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, George married. In 1934, he wed Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark, a respectable match that offered the monarchy a brief illusion of control. The ceremony was grand, the photos elegant, and the couple, well, they were lovely on paper. Marina was stylish, intelligent, and understood the assignment. She gave him 3 children. In public, she played the part of the refined duchess. In private, she reportedly endured the marriage with a kind of cold decorum, choosing dignity over confrontation. She had her friends. He had his distractions. And still, George's magnetism never dimmed. He was always on the guest list, always next to someone luminous, always arriving just a little too late, and leaving with someone who hadn't arrived with him. The press, tightly leashed in those days, rarely reported the undercurrent. But everyone in the room knew. George didn't chase scandal, he embodied it, beautifully. Yet for all his flair, his life ended not in a scandal, but in a tragedy. On August 25, 1942, Prince George died in a plane crash in Scotland. He was just 39 years old, on active duty with the Royal Air Force, flying in mysterious conditions that still draw questions from conspiracy-minded historians. The details are oddly murky. The official story says the plane veered off course. Some say there were unofficial passengers aboard. Others whisper that the mission itself was more complex than the public ever knew. What's undeniable is that his death shocked the monarchy. Not just because he was young or charming, but because he had been, in many ways, the royal family's unofficial ambassador to the 20th century, a symbol of something modern, unruly, and magnetic. He lived fast, unapologetically, and arguably too authentically for the institution that raised him. After his death, the palace closed ranks. The tributes were polished, the narrative softened. The rogue prince became a war hero. The controversies were buried in footnotes. But the whispers never stopped. Not entirely, because Prince George, Duke of Kent, was not the sort of man people forget. He left behind no public memoirs, no diary, no final word. Just stories, fragmented, fabulous, and unfinished. And if his life reads like the unfinished script of a noir film, it's only because he lived as if he were the lead character in a story the palace wasn't quite ready to publish. But the crown's discomfort with unruly royals didn't end with him. Because while Prince George vanished mid-century in a flash of metal and mystery, another royal rose decades later with lipstick, cigarettes, and a laugh that could crack protocol in half. Her name was Margaret, and unlike George, she didn't hide the chaos. She wore it like perfume. 9. Princess Margaret. Princess Margaret didn't just break the mold. She lit it on fire, stubbed out a cigarette in the ashes, and poured herself another drink. She wasn't the heir. She was the spare. And that gave her a kind of freedom few royals ever truly possess. The freedom to misbehave publicly and be forgiven privately. If her older sister, Queen Elizabeth II, was duty incarnate, Margaret was its devilish shadow. Brilliant, bitter, funny, and absolutely unwilling to pretend. From the moment she was born in 1930, Margaret Rose was both too close to the throne and too far from power. She would never rule, but she would always be watched. Raised in the golden light of post-Victorian formality, she came of age in the ruins of empire and the dawn of celebrity. She was part royal, part tabloid darling, and wholly herself, unapologetically, inconveniently, rebelliously herself. By the time the public met the adult Princess Margaret, she had already formed the habits that would define her legacy. She loved art, music, witty people, grand entrances, and long exits. She had a taste for flair and a tongue like a fencing sword. There was always a drink, always a cigarette, always a party, or at least the ghost of one that had just ended. And always, without exception, there was someone falling in love with her. She collected admirers the way others collected antiques, elegantly, excessively, and sometimes by accident. Her early romance with Group Captain Peter Townsend, a divorced Royal Air Force officer, became the stuff of modern myth. The public fell in love with their forbidden love, and Margaret, young, dazzling, in love, became the human face of royal rules colliding with real life. But it didn't last. The Church of England didn't allow her to marry a divorcee without giving up her titles and income. For a while, she considered it. Letters were exchanged, headlines speculated, and then, quietly, she walked away. Some say it broke her heart. Others say she broke her own heart before the crown could do it for her. After Townsend, Margaret's love life didn't exactly stabilize. In 1960, she married Anthony Armstrong Jones, a society photographer with an eye for rebellion and a willingness to enter the Windsor web. They were the picture of 1960s modernity, a royal and a commoner, art and aristocracy, revolution and ritual. The wedding was broadcast on television, a first for the British royal family. And for a moment, it looked like Margaret might settle into a new role. Modern princess, muse, maybe even happily married woman. She was none of those things. The marriage disintegrated under the weight of mutual disappointment, affairs, and the unbearable fact that neither of them had ever truly belonged to anyone but themselves. They lived in Kensington Palace but partied on Moustique, an island retreat that became synonymous with Margaret's second life, sun, scandals, and society dropouts. She drank. She smoked. She laughed too loud and stayed too late. She flirted with rock stars and prime ministers. She became an icon of 1960s rebellion dressed up in royal satin. People called her selfish, spoiled, arrogant. They weren't entirely wrong. Margaret could be cruel in that uniquely British way, cutting without raising her voice, condescending with a smile. But she was also funny, perceptive, and crushingly lonely in a family that only rewarded silence. She was born into a system that prized decorum above all else, then punished her for refusing to be decorous. Her public missteps were private rebellions against a world that had already decided what kind of woman she was allowed to be. She had affairs, discreet ones, dramatic ones, and ones that exploded across the tabloids like fireworks set off in a cathedral. There was Roddy Llewellyn, a gardener and aristocratic drifter 17 years her junior, whose relationship with Margaret caused the press to go feral in the 1970s. He wasn't a political threat or a serious partner. He was freedom in human form. Their photographs, her in swimwear, him in denim, both basking in the sun of nonchalance, became symbols of everything the monarchy feared and the public devoured. Yet behind the parties, the jokes, and the heavy eyeliner, there was always a sense that Margaret was performing. Not for the cameras, but for herself. A one-woman play titled, "What If I'd Been Allowed to Live Differently?" She had charm, wit, and a deep understanding of her own mythology. She knew exactly what they said about her. And sometimes she played into it, because playing along was less exhausting than explaining herself. As she aged, her world grew smaller. Health problems mounted. The cigarettes caught up, the parties faded, the island retreats turned into quiet hospital stays. And yet the image of Margaret, younger, sharper, dressed in Dior and turning her back on whatever obligation was speaking, never quite disappeared. She remained a cultural reference point, the royal who chose chaos over obedience, pleasure over perception, and drama over decorum. Her death in 2002 marked the end of something, not a reign, not a legacy of leadership, but the end of a particular kind of royal defiance. Margaret didn't break the rules because she wanted to watch the world burn. She broke them because they were always designed to contain her, and she knew she would never be allowed to be both human and royal. So she chose humanity, with all its mess, its longing, and its cocktails. But for all her rebellion, she never escaped the institution. She remained Her Royal Highness until the end. And maybe that was the cruelest part. The system she challenged still got to write the ending. Still, if Margaret was a lesson, it was this. Desire, for love, for attention, for freedom, is not a weakness. It's just never been very welcome in the House of Windsor, especially not in the case of monarchs who tried to mask their desires in formality. Men who ruled stiffly but loved secretly. Like George I, who locked away his wife, crowned his mistress, and redefined what royal passion looked like behind closed Hanoverian doors. 10. George IV. George. I ruled England with all the warmth of a ledger book and all the charisma of a damp Tuesday. He was, by most accounts, a deeply unimpressive man, stiff, blunt, barely fluent in English, and visibly more invested in bratwurst than British politics. But beneath the drab exterior of this reluctant foreign king was a domestic history so lurid it nearly eclipses his bureaucratic reign. Because while George I may not have ruled hearts in Britain, he shattered them in Hanover, spectacularly. To understand George I's tangled love life, you have to begin before he ever sat on the English throne. Born in 1660 in Hanover, then part of the Holy Roman Empire, George married his cousin Sophia Dorothea of Celle in 1682. The union was political, pragmatic, and cold from the start. George saw her as a dynastic necessity. She saw him as a brick wall. Within months, they'd grown mutually disillusioned, then mutually resentful. And from there, things devolved into the sort of marital catastrophe that would make a modern reality show producer foam at the mouth. Sophia Dorothea was young, lively, and, as it turned out, unwilling to rot quietly in royal isolation. She had a close relationship with Count Philipp Christoph von Königsmarck, a dashing Swedish nobleman whose talents included swordplay, poetry, and what polite society called unwise proximity. Whether they were lovers in the full sense or just emotionally entangled, history never confirmed. But George III didn't need confirmation. He needed an exit. In 1694, Königsmarck disappeared. Just vanished. Whispers claimed he was murdered in the palace, his body dissolved in lime or buried beneath the floors. Official records were silent. George said nothing. No charges were brought. But the message was clear. Some mistakes disappear faster than gossip. Then came the real punishment. Sophia Dorothea, George's wife and the mother of his children, was imprisoned in a remote castle in Alden. Not for a season, not for scandal management purposes, for life. She remained locked away for over 30 years, forbidden from seeing her children, stripped of her titles, and made into a royal ghost. George never divorced her. That would have required acknowledging her. He simply removed her from the world and moved on. He arrived in England in 1714, a surprise monarch thanks to the convoluted succession laws that barred Catholics from the throne. He was 54, German, and regarded with tepid confusion by his new subjects. He barely spoke the language, showed little interest in English culture, and delegated most of his duties to his ministers. But he did bring something distinctly continental. A mistress. Or more precisely, mistresses. Plural, public, and politically positioned. The most prominent of them was Erengard Melusine von der Schulenburg, a tall, angular noblewoman with the presence of a grand chandelier and the tenacity of a barnacle. She followed George from Hanover and was promptly installed in the English court under the slightly laughable title of the Duchess of Kendal. She wasn't hidden. She wasn't shamed. She was practically part of the furniture. and more durable than most of it. Melusine had enormous influence over George's private and political life. She was said to have her own income stream, land holdings, and the ear of the king at all hours. Rumors swirled that she even sold appointments, that her bedroom was a secondary cabinet office. Whether or not it was true, George never corrected the impression. If anything, he found it efficient. Then came the other one, Charlotte Sophia Kielman-Sega, Countess of Darlington, nicknamed the Elephant by an unkind press due to her size. She was also German, also a fixture at court, and allegedly the king's mistress as well. Or possibly his half-sister. Or both. Royal gossip has never been great with boundaries. George didn't care. He wasn't trying to win hearts or history books. He ran his monarchy like a tightly balanced ledger. If the numbers added up and the nobles stayed quiet, what did it matter who was in his bed? Or more accurately, which three people? The English court grumbled. The public mocked. But George, forever indifferent to public opinion, allowed the scandal to ferment just beneath the surface. His courtiers navigated the politics of the royal bedchamber with quiet panic. The queen was locked in a tower in Germany. The mistresses held informal salons in Kensington. The king issued decrees with one hand and wrote letters to Melusine with the other. When he died in 1727, in Germany, naturally, George left behind a son who hated him, a court relieved to shuffle forward, and a strange legacy, a king who couldn't rule hearts but certainly knew how to remove one from the palace. Sophia Dorothea died just weeks after him, still in captivity. She never saw her children again. She never got a trial. She never got the chance to defend herself. The punishment was silent, total, and efficient, just like her husband. If there's a lesson in George V's life, it's that power doesn't require passion, only permanence. He didn't love England. England didn't love him. But the system worked because it refused to notice the difference. Still, for all his cold calculations, George couldn't escape the one truth that haunts every royal house: desire will out. Even when buried, locked away, or dressed up in titles. And centuries before George III's carefully managed betrayals, there was another king, one who didn't hide his passion in paperwork, but who burned for it so brightly it lit the pages of medieval legend. His name was Henry II, and he fell for a woman they called the Fair Rosamond. 11. Henry II. In the grim, echoing halls of medieval English royalty, where marriages were made for land, not love, and mistresses were typically just polite acknowledgments of a monarch's boredom, Henry II stood out for being dangerously, almost poetically, invested in his passion. Not the type of passion that rewrites policy or reshapes kingdoms. No. This was the sort of aching, all-consuming obsession that left behind songs, legends, and perhaps a suspiciously poisoned cup. Born in 1133 and crowned in 1154, Henry II was a restless man with a restless empire. He ruled not just England but vast swaths of France, Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, lands that gave him more headaches than glory, more conflicts than peace. He was intelligent, hot-tempered, deeply pragmatic, and always moving. His marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the age, was politically brilliant and personally explosive. They produced 8 children and nearly as many rebellions. Eleanor didn't just match Henry in power. She matched him in will and eventually in opposition. So perhaps it makes sense that, amid the political minefields and marital fireworks, Henry found himself entranced by someone else entirely, someone who wasn't a queen or a duchess or a noble's bargaining chip. Rosamond Clifford. She appears in the records like a sudden bloom. The daughter of a relatively minor nobleman, Rosamond, later known as the Fair Rosamond, was renowned for her beauty, her gentleness, and the almost mythical way Henry seemed to dissolve in her presence. Unlike many royal mistresses who came and went in the political tide, Rosamond was different. She wasn't just a diversion. She was a fixation. The affair began around the mid-1160s, possibly after Eleanor and Henry had grown apart, or after Eleanor had been imprisoned for backing their sons in a revolt against him, depending on the timeline. Rosamund, by contrast, offered peace. No politics, no chessboard ambitions, just softness and light. She was said to be shy, delicate, luminous, and she became, in a sense, Henry's escape from the battlefield of both court and home. But of course, nothing in the 12th century was ever that simple. Rosamund's presence sparked rumors almost immediately. The court buzzed. Chronicles from the period are sparse, but the legend grew fast, that Henry had built her a private pleasure palace in Woodstock, complete with a labyrinth to keep her hidden from prying eyes, and from one particular pair of eyes in particular. Eleanor's. Ah, the legend. It's theatrical, possibly fabricated, and completely irresistible. According to later stories, Eleanor discovered the affair and stormed through the maze herself, dagger in hand, to confront the rival who had so thoroughly captivated her husband. The tale usually ends with Rosamund offered a choice between death by dagger or poison. She chose the latter, nobly or cowardly, depending on who's telling the story. Historically, this account is almost certainly nonsense. There's no hard evidence that Eleanor ever laid eyes on Rosamund, let alone murdered her. But the persistence of the myth says something about the intensity of feeling the affair inspired, both then and now. Rosamund wasn't just a mistress. She was the tragic heroine in a love story the English monarchy didn't know it was writing. What we do know is this. Rosamund died young, around 1176. The cause of death is unclear. She may have been in her 30s. Henry reportedly mourned her deeply. He buried her at Godstow Abbey, with an elaborate tomb near the nuns' high altar. For a time, she was treated almost as a sacred figure. Pilgrims visited her grave. Her memory lingered, until, of course, the church stepped in. In 1191, Bishop Hugh of Lincoln declared her tomb inappropriate and had it removed from the sacred space. She was, after all, a harlot, as the bishop reportedly described her, a reminder that even a royal's grief had limits when confronted with doctrine. Rosamund's body was reburied outside the abbey walls, a literal and symbolic exile. And Henry? He continued his turbulent reign. He warred with his sons. He fought with the church, most famously with Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, whose murder in 1170 by Henry's knights stained his legacy forever. He aged into suspicion, frustration, and bitter disappointment. But there is something curiously intimate about the fact that, in the chaos of empire and the betrayals of family, the one woman who seemed to quiet his storms was a woman history barely remembers outside of myth. Because what does it say, really, when the most powerful man in the land, married to one of the most formidable queens in Europe, builds a hidden world for a quiet woman named Rosamund? It says that even kings long for refuge. That power is lonely. That desire, when unchecked, tries to turn real people into dreams. And dreams, when they die, become legends. Henry II died in 1189, defeated by his own sons, disappointed by almost everyone he once trusted. He was buried at Fontevraud Abbey, not far from Eleanor, who outlived him. But not Rosamund. She remained buried outside the abbey gates, outside the history books, outside the reach of redemption. Still, her name lives. Not because she ruled or because she rebelled, but because she was wanted. Wanted so completely that an entire story was built to justify it. But Henry II wasn't the only monarch whose passions upended the traditional order. A century later, another king would come to the throne whose affections weren't just controversial, they were revolutionary. He didn't build mazes for his lovers. He gave them titles. He gave them power. And in doing so, Edward II nearly lost everything. 12. Edward II. Edward II didn't just confound his enemies. He perplexed history. Born in 1284, crowned in 1307, and deposed in 1327, his reign was a 20-year storm of contradiction. He was a king obsessed with pleasure but allergic to strategy, a ruler raised on war but seemingly uninterested in winning one. But the scandal that eclipsed all others, and which still causes historians to fumble with qualifiers, was this. Edward II was deeply and publicly affectionate with the wrong people the medieval world didn't know how to categorize. It began most famously with Piers Gaveston. Gaveston was a minor Gascon nobleman, and crucially, not the kind of person who was supposed to have a direct pipeline to the king's inner world. And yet, by the time Edward inherited the throne at age 23, Gaveston was already so entrenched in his affections that it caused widespread political unrest. He had titles. He had lands. He had access. The chroniclers at the time, no strangers to subtle slander, described Gaveston as bold, arrogant, and exceedingly familiar with the king, and the court hated it. Gaveston's flamboyance didn't help. He allegedly gave mocking nicknames to powerful nobles, dressed with theatrical flair, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who knew the king would protect him at any cost. That cost, as it turned out, was enormous. Parliament objected. The nobles fumed. Edward exiled Gaveston once, then twice, then brought him back both times. When the barons finally had enough, they captured Gaveston and executed him without royal consent in 1312. Edward never forgave them. Not for the betrayal, not for the murder, and possibly not just for the political implications, but for the personal rupture. He went into mourning so intense it was described as bordering on madness. And from that moment on, his reign became a long, slow unraveling of trust, power, and control. But Edward didn't stop surrounding himself with controversial companions. If anything, he doubled down. After Gaveston, the roles were filled by Hugh Despencer the Younger and his father, both of whom became Edward's primary advisors, and, in the eyes of many, corrupting influences. The younger Despencer, in particular, became almost inseparable from the king. He was granted enormous privileges, land, and political power. The barons loathed him. The queen, Isabella of France, despised him. The country teetered toward civil war. And yet Edward persisted. He refused to abandon Despencer, just as he had refused to abandon Gaveston. His emotional loyalty wasn't just deep, it was defiant. It was as if Edward had decided that personal affection outweighed national stability, that his private circle mattered more than the entire public sphere. It's tempting to interpret Edward II through a modern lens, to categorize his relationships with Gaveston and Despencer as romantic or sexual. And they may have been. But what's more revealing is how profoundly they destabilized the traditional dynamics of power. Edward didn't just love unwisely. He distributed authority based on loyalty rather than merit. His court became a soap opera, a place where proximity to the king meant instant elevation, and everyone else became a threat. Isabella, the queen, was not content to play the supporting role in Edward's domestic drama. She had been married to him since 1308. She was 12 at the time, and spent much of her life being publicly sidelined by men who were neither her husband's advisors nor merely his friends. Eventually, she decided to intervene with the subtlety of a siege engine. In 1326, she allied herself with Roger Mortimer, a powerful nobleman, and some say, her lover. Together, they invaded England, captured Edward, executed the Despensers, and forced the king to abdicate in favor of his son, Edward III. It was a quiet coup, executed with brutal efficiency. Edward was imprisoned, shuffled from castle to castle like a broken heirloom no one wanted to discard but couldn't leave on display. In 1327, he died under mysterious circumstances at Berkeley Castle. The official cause remains debated. Some say illness, some say assassination, Some whispered darker, crueler theories designed more to horrify than to inform. What remains clear is that Edward, once a king of England, died with none of the ceremony or dignity the role typically commands. And yet, Edward II refuses to vanish from historical conversation. He is one of those rare monarchs who, despite a disastrous reign, remains fascinating. Not for his policies, which were disastrous, or his wars, which were mostly lost, but for his emotional life, his deep, complicated attachments, his refusal to play the part of the medieval strongman king. He was perhaps one of the most intimate monarchs in British history, more devoted than strategic, more affectionate than effective. His sexuality, long a topic of speculation, becomes less a scandal than a window into a king who didn't rule with detachment, into a monarchy that could be toppled by affection, into a system that only tolerated desire when it was kept in the dark. Edward II did not keep it in the dark. He illuminated it, perhaps unwisely, perhaps fatally. And his story did not end with his death. His son, Edward III, would scrub his father's memory from the walls of power. Isabella would eventually fall from grace, but the image of Edward remains, a king undone not by hatred, but by intimacy, and the echoes of that story reverberated through the centuries, through every royal who tried to love without permission, who crossed the fine line between desire and disorder, like a certain queen, years later, who didn't bother to hide her lovers, who lived loud, dressed louder, and scandalized both Parliament and Paris. Her name was Queen Caroline of Brunswick, and she made adultery a public performance. 13. Queen Caroline of Brunswick. If the British monarchy had a hall of misfit legends, icons who defied expectations not with elegance but with pure, stubborn spectacle, Queen Caroline of Brunswick would be seated in the front row, drinking wine, heckling the crown, and refusing to curtsy. She was the queen who was never really a wife, the wife who was never really wanted, and the woman who turned royal scandal into a national sport. Born in 1768 in the Duchy of Brunswick, now part of Germany, Caroline was royalty by blood and chaos by temperament. She was educated, intelligent, and reportedly charming in short bursts. But those bursts often came wrapped in sarcasm, social misfires, and a ferocious disregard for convention. Even her family considered her difficult. In other words, she was a perfect candidate for a disastrous marriage with the future George IV. Their union wasn't just doomed. It was spectacularly, almost comically, misaligned from the start. George, Prince of Wales at the time, needed to marry someone, anyone, respectable enough to settle his mountain of debts and appease Parliament. Caroline, meanwhile, was a Protestant princess with the right lineage and the wrong everything else, at least in George's eyes. They met for the first time on April 5, 1795. George took one look at his bride-to-be and reportedly demanded brandy. According to witnesses, he staggered through the wedding ceremony 2 days later, visibly intoxicated, and spent the night not in wedded bliss but on the floor in a stupor. Caroline, for her part, was equally underwhelmed. She found him cold, spoiled, and reeking of gin and powdered pomposity. The marriage produced one child, Princess Charlotte, and absolutely no affection. George and Caroline separated almost immediately, and from that moment on, their relationship turned into one of the most bitter, petty, and public feuds in royal history. They lived in separate households. He banned her from court. She insulted him to anyone who would listen. It was less a royal marriage than a public Cold War. Caroline was exiled in all but name, retreating from court life and eventually traveling to Italy in 1814. And it's here that her reputation takes a sharp turn, from unwanted wife to international spectacle. While abroad, Caroline lived with a peculiar degree of independence, especially for a royal woman of her time. She surrounded herself with artists, servants, and companions of questionable background and unknown political loyalty. She entertained guests, threw parties, and paraded through Europe like an exiled duchess in a comedy of manners. The British government, ever paranoid about anything resembling independence in a royal woman, decided to spy on her. They dispatched agents to follow her, gather intelligence, and report back on what they assumed would be evidence of scandal. They were not disappointed. Enter Bartolomeo Pergami, a charming, handsome Italian who started as a servant in Caroline's household and quickly rose through the ranks to become her chamberlain, confidant, and, according to every witness with a pen, her lover. Pergami was everything Caroline's husband wasn't: attentive, warm, and disinterested in ceremony. Their closeness scandalized the British establishment. They traveled together, dined together, were allegedly seen in various states of familiarity on ships, in villas, and during long countryside rides. To the British press and Parliament, Pergami was more than a continental curiosity. He was a threat to royal dignity. Caroline, instead of denying the rumors, seemed to revel in them. She posed for portraits with him. She elevated his relatives. She ignored the angry letters and polite suggestions to behave herself. Her defiance wasn't just personal, it was political. Then came 1820. King George III died. George IV ascended the throne. And Caroline suddenly was queen, in theory. In practice, George IV was determined to prevent her from ever being crowned or recognized as such. He launched what became known as the Pains and Penalties Bill, an effort to strip Caroline of her title and dissolve the marriage on the grounds of adultery. The trial, held in the House of Lords, was an absurd mixture of political theater, character assassination, and Victorian pearl-clutching. Servants were called to testify. Stories about Pergami multiplied. How they allegedly shared rooms, how he touched her waist, how he kissed her hand. The public loved every moment of it, because if George was trying to shame her, it backfired spectacularly. Caroline became a symbol, not of virtue certainly, but of resistance. Women identified with her defiance. Men admired her nerve. Crowds cheered her name. Effigies of George were burned in the streets. The public sided with the scandal, not the crown. Eventually the bill was dropped. Caroline technically won, but victory didn't translate to acceptance. When she attempted to attend George IV's coronation in 1821, she was physically barred from Westminster Abbey. The doors were shut in her face. She was, in every possible sense, locked out of the monarchy she legally belonged to. She died a few weeks later, at age 53, after falling ill. Her final request? That her coffin be inscribed with the words, "Here lies Caroline, the injured Queen of England." No grand mausoleum, no elaborate state funeral, just one last declaration, aimed directly at the man who spent decades trying to erase her. In the end, Caroline of Brunswick wasn't a moral figure, or even a particularly virtuous one. She was messy, undiplomatic, flamboyant, and at times, deeply irritating. But she never pretended to be anything else. She refused to be erased, and in doing so, she forced a nation to consider what it really meant to be royal, and what it cost to demand dignity on your own terms. Her story, like so many before hers, showed that the monarchy had little room for uncontrolled desire, especially when it came from women. And yet, for all the drama, Caroline's story wasn't entirely unique. The crown has always orbited around scandal, and sometimes that scandal runs in families. Because before Anne Boleyn became a queen, another Boleyn woman made her own mark in the royal bedchamber. Her name was Mary, and she got there first, 14. Mary Boleyn. Mary Boleyn is a name that flutters in the margins of Tudor history, whispered, half-recorded, and frequently overshadowed by her more famous sister, Anne. But before Anne Boleyn sparked a religious revolution, before she lost her head and gained a legacy, Mary was already inside the king's bedchamber. She was, depending on your perspective, either the prototype or the warning sign. The mistress before the queen. The original Boleyn scandal. Born around 1499 into the ambitious and strategically conniving Boleyn family, Mary was groomed for court life from the start. Her family understood the unspoken rules of Tudor advancement. Charm was currency, beauty a weapon, and access to the king a shortcut to influence. Mary had all three, in abundance. What she didn't have, at least not in the same sharp-edged way as her sister, was calculation. Mary was not a schemer. She was a participant. A willing one, perhaps, but not always a strategic one. Her early years are hazy, as so many women's are in the official record. What we know is that she was sent to the French court in her teens, where she served as a maid of honor to Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's sister. This brief detour into continental life likely introduced her to the art of courtly flirtation, which in France was less a pastime and more a professional sport. Rumors swirled, then and now, that she became mistress to King Francis I. The French king himself, never known for subtlety, reportedly referred to her as "my English mare." Historians still debate the nature and accuracy of that claim, but whether true or inflated, it stuck. Reputation, once spoiled, travels faster than fact. Mary returned to England with a slightly rumpled image and was soon positioned in the court of Catherine of Aragon. But it didn't take long before her path crossed, more significantly, with Henry VIII. The exact timing of their affair remains unclear, but it likely began in the early 1520s. Mary was married by then to a courtier named William Carey. The match was respectable and well-timed, though Carey's prominence increased dramatically after Mary attracted the king's eye, always a telltale sign of royal interest. Henry rewarded Carey with grants and appointments, not because of his talent, but because of his tolerance. The affair itself left almost no written record. No love letters, no diary entries, just circumstantial evidence, court appointments, and two children, Catherine and Henry Carey, whose paternity has been the subject of endless speculation. Henry VIII never acknowledged them as his, unlike his illegitimate son with another mistress, Elizabeth Blount. But the timeline suggests possibility. The resemblance, some claim, is compelling, and the silence around it is, frankly, deafening. What's clear is this. For a time, Mary Boleyn had the king's attention. But in the Tudor court, that was never a stable position. Favor came fast and vanished faster. By the mid-1520s, Henry had lost interest. He moved on to Mary's younger sister Anne. And Mary, now with children and a cooling connection to the king, faded quietly into the background. But she wasn't finished. Mary remained at court during Anne's rise, watching as her younger sister captivated the same man who had once called for her. Anne's ascent was slow, calculating, and seismic. She withheld herself from Henry playing the long game and eventually replaced a queen. Mary, meanwhile, was sidelined. The sisters had never been particularly close, and Anne, now the center of a political and religious maelstrom, had little use for a reminder of the king's former flings. In 1534, Mary created another scandal, this one of her own making. She married a man far beneath her station, William Stafford, a soldier with no fortune, no title, and no political advantage to offer. It was, in the eyes of her family, a disgrace. She was banished from court. Her sister, then queen, refused to help. Mary, for once, had chosen love over strategy, and the price was exile. But in that exile, Mary Boleyn found something few royal-adjacent figures ever do: peace. She lived quietly in the countryside with her new husband, away from court, away from scandal, and most importantly, away from the throne's orbit. She never returned to the inner circles of power. She never regained her former status. And yet, of all the Boleyns, she may have been the only one to survive with her life and her dignity intact. Anne was executed in 1536. George Boleyn, their brother, followed. The family that had climbed so high fell with matching speed. But Mary remained, forgotten by many, spared by fate. She died in 1543, at around 44 years old. There was no royal funeral, no monuments, just a quiet end to a life that had once, for a brief and turbulent moment, helped shape the path of a kingdom. Her legacy is a strange one. She was both footnote and origin point. The first Boleyn to tempt a king, the first to learn how fleeting that favor could be. She wasn't a schemer, she wasn't a saint. She was something more familiar. Someone swept up in other people's ambitions who tried eventually to live a life of her own making. And if Mary's story was one of fading embers, the man who follows hers was all fire. Her descendant, at least in temperament, came a few generations later. A prince, once again named George. But this one didn't operate in the age of kingdoms and crusades. He came of age in the smoky drawing rooms and champagne-soaked halls of the 20th century, and he never met a secret he didn't want to chase. Prince George of Wales was less a royal and more a rumor dressed in uniform. 15. Prince George, Prince of Wales, later Duke of Kent's brother. If the British monarchy had an unofficial department of intrigue, Prince George, second son of King George V and Queen Mary, and younger brother of King Edward VIII, would have been its quietly efficient director. Born in 1902 into a house where public emotion was discouraged and privacy was a rigid, suffocating code, George grew up with all the trappings of royalty and none of the interest in behaving like it. Not to be confused with his namesake and younger brother, the Duke of Kent, the one who died mysteriously in a plane crash. This Prince George, the one who later became Duke of Kent's older sibling, was a man about town long before the press learned to track license plates. He was a royal without a cause and, for a brief period in the early 20th century, one of the most talked about figures in British high society, not for what he said or did on behalf of the monarchy, but for who he was seen with behind it. George had all the qualities of a modern aristocratic libertine, handsome, intelligent, theatrically self-possessed, and acutely aware of the limits of royal identity. He was also, like so many second sons, granted a peculiar freedom. He would never sit on the throne. That duty, with its crushing ceremonial obligations and constitutional muzzles, belonged to his older brother, Edward. And while Edward was busy cultivating a tortured image of royal romance, George was cultivating something far more interesting: access. He wasn't scandalous in the overt tabloid baiting way. George operated in shadows, polished ones, yes, draped in Savile Row suits and lined with carefully curated social circles, but shadows nonetheless. He was known for his charm, his exquisite manners, and his ability to drift between worlds. From the royal court to London's bohemian enclaves, from black-tie dinners to candlelit rendezvous far from palace walls. Actresses, heiresses, singers, countesses. George's companions were varied and strategically indistinct. He never married. He never settled. He never gave the public the satisfaction of defining him. And that was exactly the point. In a royal household obsessed with appearances and terrified of emotional transparency, Prince George's refusal to be legible made him, paradoxically, more powerful. There were rumors, of course. There always are. Some said he had an affair with a famous actress whose name is now entombed in black and white glamour. Others whispered about connections to European aristocrats with reputations for unconventional entertainments. There were even suggestions that his social reach extended into the male circles of London's more discreet nightlife, a scandalous implication in an era when such things were not just taboo, but legally dangerous. But unlike his brother, Edward, who fell apart over a single American divorcee, George never seemed consumed by his relationships. They orbited him, not the other way around. His interest in pleasure, romantic, artistic, intellectual, was a controlled burn, not a wildfire. He managed his image with the precision of a statesman, even if his official duties were minimal. That said, George wasn't just a libertine with a title. He was sharp. He was educated. He had a curious mind and a genuine interest in culture, particularly music and art. He hosted salons, supported artists, and quietly contributed to projects that fell well outside the purview of royal duty. He was, in many ways, a soft ambassador of a softer monarchy, less ceremonial, more engaged. And yet the establishment never quite knew what to do with him. He was too elusive to be useful, and too visible to be ignored. It's easy to imagine a version of history where George took on a more central role, a kind of modern royal before the institution was ready for one. But that future collapsed under the weight of others' decisions. His brother, Edward VIII, abdicated the throne in 1936 to marry Wallis Simpson, and their younger brother Albert, George VI, was thrust into power. The monarchy became serious again. War was coming. There was no more time for charm. George stepped back quietly, as he always did. He never made headlines. He never wrote memoirs. He never defended or denied the rumors that built his myth. His later years were lived away from the spotlight, in measured luxury, surrounded by people who understood discretion. He died in 1972, largely forgotten by the public, and memorialized with polite, thin-lipped tributes from those who'd once shared his drawing rooms. And yet his influence lingers in the margins, like a watermark on royal history. He was a man who understood the difference between visibility and exposure, between intimacy and scandal. He lived at the edge of monarchy, not to rebel against it, but to escape the suffocating expectations of its center. Prince George was not a cautionary tale. He was a mystery by design. He didn't chase drama, he outlasted it. But not every royal could drift above the flames. Some hurled themselves straight into the fire, fiery romantics dressed in muslin and madness, unfiltered and gloriously doomed, like Lady Caroline Lamb, a woman who made scandal an art form and called Lord Byron mad, bad, and dangerous to know, mostly because she beat him to it. 16. Lady Caroline Lamb. Lady Caroline Lamb never officially held a royal title. She wasn't born into the line of succession, never wore a coronation gown, and didn't marry into the direct bloodline of kings. And yet, for a brief incandescent window in the early 19th century, she was as close to the center of royal chaos as any crowned figure, and infinitely more dangerous. If royalty is a performance, Caroline was a pyromaniac with a spotlight. Her lovers were famous, her outbursts legendary, and her grip on reality negotiable. She once described herself as a female Don Quixote, which is a generous self-assessment, provided Don Quixote had a flair for ballroom scandal and a tendency to stalk poets. Born in 1785 to the aristocratic Ponsonby family, Caroline was the niece of the Duke of Devonshire and granddaughter of a prime minister. Her bloodline flowed through every corridor of power in Georgian Britain. She was raised with privilege, educated beyond the expectations for women of her class, and possessed a mind that ran faster than any rule book could contain. Caroline didn't just challenge convention, she ignored it. Her beauty was unconventional, her manners volatile, her wit sharp enough to wound. By the time she was a teenager, she had already acquired a reputation as precocious, which in aristocratic parlance meant brilliant, possibly unstable, and prone to quoting Shakespeare at dinner parties. In 1805, she married William Lamb, a rising politician who would later become Lord Melbourne. Yes, that Lord Melbourne, the same one who would go on to mentor Queen Victoria decades later. But long before he was royal confidant, he was Caroline's polite, brooding husband. The marriage was strained from the start. William was steady, cautious, and emotionally withdrawn. Caroline was none of those things. She oscillated between passionate declarations and icy distance. They had one son, Augustus, who was developmentally disabled and required extensive care, something that added weight to an already mismatched relationship. But Caroline didn't implode immediately. For a time, she played the part of the dutiful political wife. She hosted salons, circulated through London's social scene, and maintained the fragile grace expected of her class. Then, in 1812, she met Lord Byron. Yes, that Byron. The romantic poet, the national heartthrob, the original celebrity narcissist. He was 24. She was 26. Their affair, though brief, detonated the landscape of polite society. Byron later tried to downplay it, calling her a strange, dangerous woman, which was rich coming from a man who had openly seduced half of Europe and considered brooding a legitimate profession. Caroline, however, was not interested in being forgotten. She described Byron as mad, bad, and dangerous to know, a line that has since become a permanent part of literary history, and arguably the most famous ex-boyfriend review ever written, but behind the epigrams was a woman in free fall. The affair with Byron unraveled her. She became obsessive, sending letters, following him in public, writing thinly veiled novels where the villain bore more than a passing resemblance to her former lover. She was, by the standards of her time, undone. And yet, her undoing was also her most creative period. Caroline wrote poetry, novels, essays. Her first novel, Glenarvan, 1816, was a scandalous Roman éclat in which Byron was cast as a seductive villain, and the heroine was, unmistakably, a version of herself. The book was a commercial sensation and a social catastrophe. The aristocracy was horrified, not by the prose, but by the transparency. Caroline had made private humiliation public art. She'd aired the dirty laundry of the elite and embroidered it with dramatic monologues. Naturally, she was exiled from polite society. Her marriage disintegrated. Her name became shorthand for instability. But Caroline refused to go quietly. She staged her own dramatic episodes at parties, dressed as male characters from literature, and once reportedly attempted to enter a ball dressed as a page boy just to spy on Byron. These weren't the antics of a woman seeking attention. They were the gestures of someone who refused to be edited out of the story. Her connection to royalty wasn't merely figurative. As the wife of William Lamb, who would later serve as Queen Victoria's first prime minister, she hovered on the outer orbit of court life. But she was never allowed to fully belong, not because she lacked the pedigree, but because she refused the performance. Where other women whispered and maneuvered, Caroline exploded. Where others curated, she confessed. By the 1820s, her health had begun to fail. Years of emotional strain, social isolation, and the physical toll of public rejection took their toll. She died in 1828 at the age of 42, largely forgotten by the world that once could not stop talking about her. William Lamb, who had stood by her longer than most would have, refused to speak ill of her after her death. In private, he acknowledged her brilliance, her torment, and her refusal to play a role she never auditioned for. In the years since, Caroline has been reimagined as a kind of feminist icon. A deeply flawed one, certainly, but also a woman who insisted on being known in a world that preferred women silent and smiling. Her romantic entanglements, especially with Byron, were scandalous, not because they happened, but because she dared to narrate them herself. She turned her desire into dialogue, her heartbreak into narrative, her marginalization into spectacle. She wasn't born royal, but she exposed royalty, and those orbiting it, for what it was, a carefully managed fiction held together by silence. And if Lady Caroline Lamb tore through the aristocracy like a hurricane in lace, the next royal did it with much quieter rebellion. She was the daughter of a queen, an artist in secret, and a woman who blurred the lines between privilege and privacy. Princess Louise, Duchess of Argyll. The Bohemian princess who never stayed inside the lines. 17. Princess Louise, Duchess of Argyll. Princess Louise was never quite what the palace wanted her to be. Born in 1848 as the sixth child of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, she was part of an empire's most scrutinized bloodline. But where her siblings often played their roles with Victorian precision, stoic, dutiful, quietly tethered to the machinery of monarchy, Louise was the outlier, the bohemian, the artist, the rumored radical, the royal who, depending on which whisper you followed, painted in secret, sculpted under a false name, loved both sexes, and once scandalized the court by being interesting. From the beginning, she showed signs of mischief not born from rebellion, but from an irrepressible personality. She had a sharp tongue and a sharper mind, and her early education, overseen by the strict Duchess of Kent and later by governesses of Albert's design, did little to soften either. Louise read voraciously, questioned constantly, and chafed against the rigidity of court life like a horse pawing at the stable door. Unlike her elder sisters, she wanted more than a ceremonial marriage or an endless rotation of state dinners. She wanted independence, expression, and, in a most un-Victorian turn of events, a room of her own. To the horror of many around her, she pursued art seriously, not as a royal pastime, but as a profession. She studied at the National Art Training School, later the Royal College of Art, becoming one of the few women, let alone royals, of her time to train alongside men. Her sculptures were well received, even critically praised, though some suggested that her identity shielded her from harsher judgment. Others, less politely, whispered that her instructors dared not critique her, lest they find themselves reassigned to some remote imperial outpost. But Louise didn't just sketch still lifes and polite busts of foreign dignitaries. Her work had emotional heft. She sculpted Queen Victoria's hands with almost clinical intimacy, produced memorials, and dabbled in architectural design. Some of her pieces still stand today, quietly signed with her name, while others are speculated to have been published anonymously. Proof that even as a princess, she suspected her talent might only be taken seriously if it arrived without a title. Her personal life, too, was the subject of relentless speculation. For a woman born into the most examined family in the empire, she managed to preserve a remarkable level of mystery. There were whispers of close relationships with women, none publicly confirmed, all vaguely catalogued by biographers working with tweezers and disclaimers. In the genteel language of Victorian euphemism, she had deep and loyal friendships with several female companions. Whether or not these were romantic is impossible to prove, and perhaps beside the point. The intensity of these relationships alone was enough to stir gossip. She also had a number of male admirers, many inappropriate by royal standards. One particularly persistent rumor concerned her tutor, the sculptor Joseph Edgar Boehm, whose close working relationship with Louise raised eyebrows at court. When Boehm died suddenly in 1890, newspapers ran oblique references to a sudden collapse in the presence of a distinguished lady. No names were named, but readers connected the dots. The palace issued no statements. Louise never addressed it. The silence only thickened the story. In 1871, in what might have been an attempt at normalizing her public image, or just containing her independence, Louise was married to John Campbell, Marquis of Lorne, heir to the Duke of Argyll. It was, on paper, a clever match. He was noble, intelligent, and politically engaged. He would later serve as Governor-General of Canada. But the marriage was odd from the start. There were no children. They spent long periods apart. Letters between them suggest affection, but not passion. Some historians describe the union as companionable, which in royal code often means professionally polite and romantically non-functional. Still, Louise embraced her role as Duchess of Argyll with a kind of pragmatic flair. She traveled, supported women's education, and advocated for the arts. While in Canada, she reportedly loathed the formality of vice-regal life, but managed to leave a lasting impression, both for her social poise and her stubborn refusal to act like a political accessory. She hiked, painted, and once allegedly disappeared into the woods for hours, ignoring staff panic while she sketched a riverbank. Back in Britain, her later years were quieter but no less independent. She continued to sculpt, hosted artists and thinkers, and managed to stay just far enough from the center of royal life to maintain her autonomy. When Queen Victoria died in 1901, the monarchy modernized, but not nearly fast enough to match Louise, who had been modern in instinct from the beginning. She died in 1939 at the age of 91, having outlived all her siblings and nearly all her contemporaries. She was cremated, a highly unusual choice for a royal at the time, and interred with minimal pomp by her own request. Louise's life never ignited full-blown scandal, but it shimmered with quiet defiance. She never blew the roof off Buckingham Palace, but she did carve her initials into its floorboards. Her rebellion was not loud, it was lived. In marble, in friendships, in glances exchanged beyond the reach of official records. She remains, in many ways, unknowable, which might be the point. Because if Victorian royals were meant to be porcelain dolls in glass cabinets, Princess Louise escaped the case, took up a chisel, and made something else entirely. And while her rebellion was carved in stone, the next royal's was forged in fire and youth. He was a king before he was a man, a soldier before he was sober, and before Agincourt turned him into legend. Henry V was a wild prince with a taste for everything life wasn't supposed to offer someone destined to wear a crown. 18. Henry V. Long before he was the hero of Agincourt, long before Shakespeare rebranded him as a solemn, steel-eyed warrior poet, Henry V was something else entirely, reckless, restless, and unmistakably alive. The young prince, known in his early years as Prince Hal, moved through late medieval England not as a sober heir to the throne, but as its unruly shadow. He drank, he fought, he wandered the streets incognito, and according to contemporary sources, he had a notable fondness for the kind of company his father's courtiers preferred not to mention in polite company. Born in 1386 or 1387, Henry was the eldest son of Henry Bolingbroke, later Henry IV, and Mary de Bohun. By all dynastic expectations, he should have been raised carefully, kept at a distance from the world's more chaotic pleasures, trained from the cradle to govern. But the politics of his childhood were anything but orderly. His father seized the throne from Richard II in 1399 in what was essentially a dynastic power grab. Prince Hal, suddenly heir apparent, entered a world already strained by rebellion and suspicion. It didn't help that he was only a teenager, newly visible, and far more interested in personal exploits than statecraft. What followed were years of increasingly colorful behavior. Chronicles describe him frequenting taverns, mixing with commoners, and involving himself in brawls and escapades that were either exaggerated for drama or toned down to spare royal embarrassment. He spent a great deal of time in London's more disreputable districts, where vice was cheap and discretion cheaper. According to legend, though it's worth noting the sources are a mix of gossip, propaganda, and later embellishment, Hal was arrested at one point and even struck a judge, demanding the release of one of his companions. The judge refused, and his father, the king, praised the magistrate's integrity. It is almost impossible to separate the myth from the man here. Much of Hal's youthful notoriety comes down to a single enduring image, the playboy prince who reforms. Shakespeare, ever the national myth-maker, immortalized this transformation in Henry IV and Henry V, turning Hal's wild adolescence into a theatrical parable of redemption. But even Shakespeare's narrative, of a wayward boy finding his purpose, is based on a seed of truth. Because Hal's youthful indulgences weren't just personal, they were performative. He knew he was being watched, knew that every laugh in a tavern, every whispered liaison, every late-night departure from a noble's household added to a reputation that, paradoxically, insulated him from greater suspicion. If he looked like a fool, people wouldn't fear him, and that bought him time. Historians have long speculated that Hal's behavior, whether genuinely impulsive or cleverly curated, served as a kind of mask. He was, after all, a prince in a fragile dynasty. His father's reign was marked by rebellion, his claim to the throne not universally accepted. By projecting carelessness, Hal lowered expectations. Then, when the time came, he exceeded them spectacularly. But before the redemption, there were the indulgences. He surrounded himself with friends who lived at the margins of respectability. Poets, squires, entertainers, and, if rumors are to be believed, a steady rotation of women who came and went with no official record. Some say he had a mistress in nearly every town between London and the Welsh Marches. Others suggest he fathered illegitimate children. None of it was formally acknowledged, because why would it be? A prince wasn't required to confess, only to conceal well enough that his reputation remained salvageable. When he wasn't entertaining or being entertained, Hal threw himself into military campaigns, not necessarily out of discipline, but perhaps as a kind of structured chaos. He fought in Wales against Owain Glyndwr's rebellion and was wounded in battle at Shrewsbury in 1403, taking an arrow to the face. The injury nearly killed him and left a lifelong scar, a physical reminder that no amount of youthful charm could shield him from mortality. That battle, many believe, was the beginning of the transformation. As his father's health declined, Hal stepped into more responsibility, slowly shedding the wild prince persona and embracing the role of a statesman. When Henry IV died in 1413, the transition was complete. Hal became Henry V, and with it, the legend began. The formerly wayward prince launched a military campaign in France that culminated in the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. A stunning English victory immortalized for its drama, its long odds, and its carefully constructed mythos of heroic kingship. And just like that, the scandalous youth disappeared from the narrative. But perhaps that's the real trick. Hal's early life didn't vanish. It was absorbed. The transformation from rogue to ruler wasn't a clean break. It was a repurposing. The same charisma that made him beloved in taverns made him a commander soldiers would follow through mud and death. The same hunger for thrill once spent on nighttime mischief now found a home in military conquest. Henry V died young, in 1422 at the age of 35. He left behind a legacy of heroism, immortal speeches, and unfinished empire building. He also left behind the ghost of a youth spent pushing the limits of royal behavior, a reminder that even the most celebrated kings often begin as their own worst headline. And while Henry's legend was eventually polished into patriotic marble, another king's legacy remained far more unsettled, both in life and in love. Because if Hal had to be tamed into greatness, the next royal never pretended to be tame at all. Richard I the Lionheart was every bit the warrior. But what he kept hidden beneath the armor still fuels centuries of speculation. 19. Richard I, the Lionheart. Richard I was many things: crusader, conqueror, king, but he was never quite what his reputation claimed. The man England remembers as Coeur de Lion was born in Oxford in 1157, but he barely lived in the country he ruled. He spoke French, called Aquitaine home, and spent less than 6 months of his decade-long reign on English soil. Yet despite this, his name echoes through national memory like a war drum. Not because he was a great ruler, he wasn't, but because he was a great myth. And Richard, as it turns out, was also a man who defied the moral template of kingship in ways that left his biographers fumbling for euphemisms. His reign may have been marked by war, glory, and prison ransoms, but his personal life was far murkier. Whispers followed him across the continent, from the courts of Europe to the battlefields of the Holy Land. And many of those whispers had less to do with his military strategies than with the question royal chroniclers hated most: who exactly was the Lionheart in love with? Richard was the third legitimate son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, which means he was born into a family defined by ambition, betrayal, and the kind of emotional dysfunction that would make a modern therapist retire early. He was his mother's favorite and inherited from her the Duchy of Aquitaine, along with a fiery temperament, a love for poetry, and a knack for political theater. As a teenager, Richard was already leading armies against his father. By his 20s, he was a knight commander in his own right, renowned for his bravery, admired for his charisma, and utterly disinterested in diplomacy. He eventually succeeded to the throne in 1189 after a period of familial infighting that would have made Shakespeare wince. England welcomed him like a returning hero. The truth was more complicated. Immediately after his coronation, Richard set off for the Third Crusade. The Holy Land called, and the king answered, not just out of piety, but out of pride. Jerusalem, after all, was less a spiritual destination and more a battlefield worthy of a warrior king's resume. Richard's campaign was militarily impressive and politically disastrous. He fought Saladin to a draw, brokered a temporary truce, and never actually reclaimed Jerusalem. But he returned to Europe with stories of valor, songs composed in his honor, and the kind of legend that deflects uncomfortable questions. Questions like, why didn't Richard ever seem especially interested in his queen? He married Berengaria of Navarre in 1191 during his crusade. She was well-born, virtuous, and politically convenient. But by most accounts, theirs was a ceremonial union. Berengaria spent almost no time with him. She never even set foot in England while he ruled it. There's little record of their interactions, fewer of their affections, and no children. This might not be shocking for a medieval royal marriage, which often prioritized alliance over attraction. But in Richard's case, the absence of documented lovers, especially female ones, left an opening. And through that opening stepped rumor. Several contemporary chroniclers commented on Richard's unusually close relationships with certain male courtiers, most notably Philip II of France. The two kings were political allies early in their reigns, but their alliance was unusually affectionate. Chroniclers described them as sharing a bed, an act that, in medieval terms, was not necessarily sexual, but still deeply intimate. Some wrote of their excessive closeness, their long periods of time spent in private, their openly expressed affection. Of course, such observations were filtered through the politics of the time. Later chroniclers, especially hostile ones, weaponized these rumors. Enemies cast Richard as indulgent, morally lax, overly fond of his male companions. Supporters denied it vehemently. Modern historians have spent decades picking through these half-veiled records, trying to determine whether Richard's affections were romantic, platonic, or simply different from our modern categories. The truth, of course, is unknowable. What matters more is that Richard seemed to live without concern for conventional domestic life. He was a king who spent his days planning sieges, composing poetry in Occitan, and ordering the construction of fortresses, not building a dynasty. He named no heirs, left no acknowledged mistresses, and avoided the rituals of marital affection that made other kings relatable, or at least predictable. What Richard did leave behind was legend. Tales of his valor at Jaffa, his duels with Saladin, his long, humiliating captivity in Austria, during which his ransom nearly bankrupted England. He returned to his realm a stranger. He was wounded in battle during a minor siege in 1199 and died of gangrene. His final words reportedly were spoken to the man who shot him. He forgave him. And then he was gone. His body was buried in 3 different places. His heart in Rouen, his entrails in Chalus, his body in Fontevraud beside his parents. A divided king, fittingly split across the empire he spent most of his life defending. And yet, for all his military prowess and songs sung in his name, Richard's personal life remains his most enduring riddle. Was he a celibate crusader? A closeted lover? A man too married to war to be touched by intimacy? Historians can't agree, but the silence he left in the archives is loud. Richard I reigned through his sword, not through his heirs. He was lion-hearted on the battlefield and sphinx-like in the bedroom. And if he left behind no children, no confessions, no romantic letters, perhaps it's because he knew that legacy, once spoken aloud, is never really yours again. And so the Lionheart remains unsolved, glorious, elusive, and maddeningly opaque, which makes him the perfect prelude to a modern royal whose scandals were far less poetic but no less persistent. Because centuries later, in the age of paparazzi and press conferences, Another prince would turn his search for pleasure into a national spectacle. He was born into duty, baptized in headlines, and crowned the king of tabloid chaos. He was Prince Harry. And for a while, he didn't seem all that interested in being tamed. 20. Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex. Before he was a husband, a father, or a global lightning rod for royal controversy, Prince Harry was something far simpler. A problem. A ginger-haired, grinning, headline-generating paradox who was born into the world's most rigid institution and almost immediately began testing its elasticity. He was the spare, which in Windsor terminology meant he had all of the scrutiny and none of the certainty. His older brother William was the heir, the future king, the chosen narrative. Harry was the contrast, the distraction. And from his earliest years, he fulfilled the role with unsettling precision. Born in 1984 to Prince Charles and Princess Diana, Harry entered the public imagination almost immediately and never really left. He was charming, rebellious, and emotionally unpredictable, the sort of royal who made tradition look like a dare. He was also the child of a media icon and a monarchy in slow-motion crisis. The tension between those two facts would define the rest of his life. By the time he reached adolescence, the British press had already made him a tabloid staple. His school misadventures were front-page news. His every friendship was dissected for scandal potential. And unlike his older brother, who cultivated a persona of quiet, manageable dignity, Harry leaned into the chaos. He wasn't merely caught off guard by the press. He seemed to dare them to catch him misbehaving. Late-night parties, questionable Halloween costumes, candid photos that appeared when cameras weren't supposed to be there. It wasn't subtle, and it wasn't accidental. Harry was doing something very old in a very new world, using rebellion to forge identity. But to frame Harry as just a rebellious royal misses the point. His behavior wasn't merely about indulgence. It was about friction. Between duty and desire. Between public expectation and private grief. Between the institution he was born into and the world he actually wanted to live in. Because underneath the antics was a much darker undertow. The trauma of losing his mother, Princess Diana, when he was just 12 years old. Diana's death in 1997 shattered more than just the royal family's public image. It shattered Harry's personal compass. He walked behind her coffin through the streets of London in front of a global audience. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He just walked. Later, he would admit that he suppressed his emotions for years, burying them beneath deflection and distraction. His early 20s were marked by a restlessness that veered between theatrical partying and attempts at service. His military career became a turning point. Harry trained at Sandhurst, served in the British Army, and undertook 2 tours in Afghanistan. There, away from cameras and ceremonial duties, he found a form of clarity. Soldiers didn't care about his title. He wasn't a prince to them, just another officer. The military gave him structure, meaning, and distance from the suffocating performance of royalty. It also gave him a sense of purpose, which he later channeled into the creation of the Invictus Games, a global sporting event for wounded service personnel. For a time, it seemed like Prince Harry had finally reconciled his past with a path forward. And then came the next act. Harry's relationship with American actress Meghan Markle marked the beginning of what would become one of the most dramatic and divisive royal chapters of the 21st century. Their courtship was fast, public, and immediately combative, not between them, but between them and the British press. Meghan's mixed-race background, her career, and her outsider status made her an immediate target for toxic tabloid speculation. The scrutiny was aggressive, often racially coded, and relentless. Harry, already hostile toward the press for what he saw as their role in his mother's death, snapped. He didn't just marry Meghan. He began to dismantle the entire framework of expectation around him. In 2020, the couple stepped back from royal duties, moved to North America, and eventually gave an interview to Oprah Winfrey that detonated like a controlled demolition through the facade of royal decorum. They spoke of mental health struggles, institutional coldness, and isolation within the firm, the family business hybrid that runs royal life with polished smiles and iron gloves. Harry described feeling trapped, even as a senior royal. He wasn't just talking about protocol. He was talking about the cultural machinery of monarchy itself. Critics accused him of hypocrisy, of rejecting privilege while clinging to titles, of abandoning duty for California Sun and Netflix deals. Supporters called it self-preservation. The truth, as always, is muddier. What Harry seemed to want, more than anything, was the impossible. To be royal and free. To be known and safe. To be part of a family that didn't demand he perform grief or dignity or silence. And so Prince Harry, once the wayward second son, became something far more complicated. A royal who refused the story written for him. Not because he despised the monarchy, but because he understood exactly how much it expected him to give up. The sex, the scandals, the partying, all of it was the visible surface of a man trying to define himself under circumstances where self-definition is nearly impossible. He wasn't the first royal to rebel. He was just the first to do it with a mic, a memoir, and a media contract. And perhaps that's what makes his story the right place to end. Because from Henry VIII's appetites to Harry's exile, the British monarchy has always been haunted by one recurring question. What happens when people, real, flawed, passionate people, are born into an institution that demands they be symbols instead? The answer, almost always, is scandal, and the occasional sex addict.